All right, welcome back to our study on the book of 1 Corinthians. This is session 2. We're going to get a little bit of the historical background for the city of Corinth. And although it had already been around for a long time, it became really one of the major cities in the world about the 8th century. Now, BC, think about, you would said the 8th century BC. When is that? Think about the reign of Uzziah, king of Judah. What prophet do we have in which that is prominent? That's Isaiah, remember? So think about that time. This city is very prominent even at that time. That's partly due to the location of the city. We're going to see some maps in a minute that will give us a little bit of an idea of that. When Rome was conquering the known world at that time, when it came to Greece, there were wars that were fought. 4 Macedonian wars. Okay, not going to bore you with the details of that, but after that 4th war, there was an effort still in Greece to keep Rome from gaining control of Greece. Now, there was a lot of city-states in there. In other words, cities that were big enough to have an army and to be able to defend themselves and have their own form of government. They kind of ruled autonomously in and of themselves. They made a pact. They actually made a league together. Now, Corinth was one of those cities. It's a big city. It's got a double port. It's wealthy. It's at the crossroads of the world, basically. It because of its geography, which again we'll see in a minute, had a great ability to defend itself. And so an alliance was made among these Grecian city-states called the Greek-Achaean League. Now, if I'm saying that wrong, if there's some Greek scholar and I get that wrong, I apologize. Not my forte, but everybody gets what I'm talking about. If you know where Achaia is, then you get that's what the league is made up of. And so a lot of these city-states, they banded together to resist the Roman Republic from taking control of Greece. This is the start of what historians call the Achaean War. Now, the Macedonian Wars have come and gone. Now you've got the Achaean War, and the people in Corinth feel like, man, we got a big army. We're in a really good defensible position. We think we can do this. So as Rome is coming through there, you have to understand that the first battle is a rout. The Roman army completely routs this league army. There's just not much there. But it's almost wintertime, and so the Roman army, after this battle, they just kind of pitch camp. They're going to just wait out the winter, and then they're going to march to Corinth. And when they do, they're marching with 23,000 infantry and just under 4,000 cavalry. Now, I want you to compare that with what's going on at Corinth. They didn't have now Rome has 23,000 infantry. Corinth has 13. We have almost 4,000 cavalry for the Roman army. Corinth has 650. So you can tell it's pretty lopsided in just the numbers. But now here's the thing that I want you to understand, because this is what happened to Corinth. Remember, all the way back to the 8th century BC, they're blowing and going. They're a big-time city. But in order to make an example, because Corinth was kind of the ringleader of this Achaean revolt, and to make an example of them, what they did was there was a Roman general named Mummius, and he was very strict about this. He received orders from the Roman Senate on how to do this. So this wasn't him just acting autonomously. But what happened was he was ordered to put to death every male adult Corinthian that was in this league fighting against the Romans. Now, if you were in the fight, but you were not a Corinthian, you were set free and you got to walk away. But if you were a Corinthian, you got put to death. When they came into Corinth, all of the women and children went into slavery. Every single one of them without exception. Everybody else was turned loose. And the history record is pretty replete with Mummius is being meticulous that he is not going to put to death or put into slavery one person who is not a Corinthian. He's going to make sure that everybody knows, here's Corinth is kind of the big shot in the league, so we're going to make the example of them, and they did. They go into Corinth, they completely destroy the city, they tear all of the walls down, they tear down all of the buildings, they take all of their weaponry, all of their military equipment, they just take it into the Roman arsenal, and finally, almost 100 years later, Julius Caesar orders for Corinth to be rebuilt. It's been nothing but a pile of rubble for a century. And in 44 AD, he declares that they're going to rebuild this. They're going to make it the capital of Achaia, which is the southern portion of Greece. And so Paul doesn't show up in Corinth, as we saw from our last session, until his second apostolic journey. Now that happened in 53 AD. Now some numbers start to come into play. When did Caesar order this to be rebuilt? 44 AD. So almost 10 years after Caesar said, let's rebuild this thing, that's when Paul is in Corinth for his second apostolic journey. But remember, he's not there very long. By the way, I've got I'll just show you this. This was such a big deal in history. This is actually a painting here called The Sack of Corinth. It's by Thomas Allen. He painted this in 1863. I'm sorry, that's so grainy. I blew it up so you could see it when I did. It looks like it got all grainy. But you got a picture of that, I think, in your notes. And you can always look that up and get a clear shot of that. Now, I would like to talk to you about Corinth in Paul's day just a little bit. I talked to you about that 4-mile wide isthmus. What happens is you have the main land of Greece, and then you've got this, the water comes in and it almost cuts the country of Greece in half. It just leaves a 4-mile wide neck. Now that's not very big. And so what would happen is the ships would sail in and they would come in. That's why I said it had a double port. Well, what do you have? You have one on each side of this isthmus, right? So they would sail in on one side. I'm going to show you pictures of this, but they actually devised a roadway so that ships that were not too large, they could actually, float them right up over the top of some transport wheeled vehicles, pull that out of the water, roll it 4 miles, and put it back in the water on the other side. Of course, they're charging a fee to do that. But nobody really wanted to sail around the southern tip of Greece. The winds and the tides were so contrary that, people developed these little sayings about that. And one of those sayings, I may get to it later, but it said, if you double your way around the Cape down there, then you'll never make it home. In other words, if you made it once, you got lucky. If you try to do it twice, you just know you're not going to make it. So it's very treacherous. So it would be better to avoid all of that. Plus, that's a longer trip. You've got the danger of losing everything. And so what they would do is they would go across there. And at the same time, you're in this big city where a lot of things are available. And so they kind of looked at it that way. And so that's what was happening there. Let me give you a couple of pictures here so you can kind of see what's happening. Now, now, there is now a canal. I am going to talk to you about that. We're not going to talk about it today. We'll talk about it in the first session next time, and then we'll be into the first chapter in the second session. But you can kind of see here. Can you see this canal that's been cut across here? So that thing, that got started under Nero. He had all of these criminals and slaves. He shipped them all to Corinth, and he said, you guys dig this out. But dig this out doesn't really do justice to what's going on, because what this is solid rock. And it's tall. I mean, you understand, it may be only 4 miles across, But this is pretty high. Now I'm going to give you a couple of pictures so that you'll understand this. So one of those is at the mouth when you're first going, oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so this is the road. You can kind of see here how they did this. They put this road down. This is where they would roll those ships over and pull them in. I put a couple of those pictures together for you. But now here's where the ships would go. So this is one right at the start, and you can tell it kind of starts off not super high, but it starts getting higher and higher as it goes. I want you to just look at this. I did this so you could see. That's a solid rock face. You know what that is? That's just a mountain. And they're just cutting through the mountain with that. Now, I'm going to give you another one. This one is kind of in the middle. Now you get more of an idea of how steep that is. And they just cut that down. And by the way, that did not get done in Nero's lifetime. He died just a couple of years after he commissioned them all. You know, it was win-win, right? I'm getting rid of all these vermin in Rome. I'm shipping them to Corinth. And they're going to cut me a route through over there. Well, you know what? He's dead in a couple of years. So that never happened. And it really wasn't until it was modern times before this got cut. When they did that, yeah. So when this got cut, it could accommodate the ships that were out there, but nowadays we have cruise ships that are too big. They can't fit through that. So just to give...
Was it around the island?
Huh?
I said, how far was it around that island?
I don't know the miles of that. I don't know. But it was more than 4 miles. So... I don't know, Bob, but I can find out about that. Okay, so I want to give you just kind of a picture. It's kind of a rendition of how they move those boats. Get an idea here. You can tell, well, again, it's grainy because I blew it up. But these are guys that are pulling. This thing is on wheels. It's kind of hard to pick all of that up. But they just roll that thing up, and then they just trek it right across that road and put it back in the water over on the other side. To most of the guys that were on the ship, this is a welcome alternative to putting themselves and their cargo and their ship at risk by going around the Cape. The religious atmosphere at Corinth is Aphrodite was one of the main goddesses that they worshiped there. There was a temple that was made to her, and the Romans called her Venus. So if you were Greek, it was Aphrodite. It was Venus if you were Roman. And I want to give you an idea because they built this temple, and it actually sits up on the Acrocorinth. Now, just to spell it so you'll understand what I'm doing here. The Acrocorinth, okay? The Acrocorinth is the high Corinth. In other words, it's a mountain that is actually, you'll see it in just a moment, it's situated in behind the city of Corinth, and it goes up really high. That's the reason this was so defensible, because you could put your army up there and everybody's fighting up steep hill to try to overtake everybody. So they built the temple of Aphrodite right up on the very top there. And let me tell you that before the Romans destroyed everything, and they destroyed that temple too. Before they destroyed everything, that was a full-blown circus of debauchery. And, the thing is, though, after it was rebuilt, there were so many other false gods that the Romans allowed to come in. This never fully returned to its old glory into what it was before. Now, I know sometimes when you read, they'll talk about 1,000 temple prostitutes, and they're going into Corinth and all the sailors and, and all that kind of business. But that's really before Rome destroyed that. It really never came back to that. Let me give you a shot here of the Acrocorinth. So here you are. So look, here's part of this roadway that goes into Corinth. Here's the Acrocorinth in behind. So you get an idea of what, have you been there, Aaron? Okay. So you get an idea of that. Let me give you another one here. When you're on the Acrocorinth, a little better than halfway up, but you're looking down. That gives you, see, now you're looking right out, at the water, and you can see the city down below. And so you still got a ways to go to get up there, but you can tell this would be a tough go if you're going to try to take that over, right? But what happened was Corinth got kind of an inflated view of what they'd be able to do, so they did not meet the Romans here. Remember, they had to winter where the Achaean War took place. That first battle was a complete rout. They lost almost everything. It reminded me of the British at Dunkirk. They just lost just about everything there. So they had this very defensible position. They didn't have anybody left to man it, when it was over. Because they're killing everybody or selling them into slavery. I'll give you one more shot of this so you kind of get an idea of how these walls were and the way that the defenses are. That's pretty formidable. And so anyway, so when you hear someone talk about the Acrocorinth, that's what you're talking about, the Temple of Aphrodite. Although it did get rebuilt up there, it's up there on the Acrocorinth as well. There's something else about Corinth that and the reason I bring it up is because Paul is actually going to allude to this in some of the things that he says in his letter to the Corinthians. Now, the Olympics had been around for a long time. There was another set of games called the Isthmian Games for the isthmus, that narrow 4-mile neck of land. And every 2 years, Corinth hosted the Isthmian Games from 580 BC all the way to 146 when Rome came in and destroyed it. So for centuries, they had these games. They were a really big deal. They were second really only to the Olympics. And so Paul is actually going to, he's going to make references that, when he talks in his epistles about running to receive the prize, and all that kind of business, everybody would be familiar with that in this area because of their exposure to these kinds of games. And I have an artist rendition of that. But anyway, just to kind of say, everybody kind of knew what that was. A lot of athletic events and even musical competitions were a part of this. Not the ones like Nero participated in. I don't know if you remember that, but when we were talking in Romans, Nero would always enter the music competitions and he would sing for so long. And, he's the emperor, so you got to cheer, right? And remember, people faked dying so they would get carried out of the Colosseum because it just went on and on. I mean, that's just pretty desperate, isn't it? Hey, I'm having a heart attack. And, and so people are, I'll carry him. Don't want you to miss the emperor. So, and he was not the best, but he always won first prize. Well, Isthmian Games were a little more legit than that. By the time the Apostle Paul arrives on the scene, now Corinth has the largest population in Greece. Not bad for 10 years, huh? I mean, they started rebuilding that thing in 44, and by the time Paul shows up in that second journey, they're already the largest population in Greece. And of course, there's a lot of Jews and Romans that's part of that. There's some other names in your notes. I give you some of those names where Jewish people are using a Roman name. I mentioned Aquila and Priscilla as an example of that. But I also give you a couple of examples where someone, it looks like they kept that Jewish name and didn't make that change. I don't think that's a big deal. The doctrine doesn't depend on that. But after Corinth is rebuilt, they did rebuild that Temple of Aphrodite. I'll bring that picture back up and show it to you. They did rebuild that temple. In your notes, I'm not going to cover this here in just the doing of this lesson, but there are two big cults that arose. I mentioned those in your notes in a box. They're kind of separate from each other, from the rest of the notes, just because I think that's an interesting background. We may have an opportunity to explore a little bit of that as we work through the book of Corinthians. But anyway, I gave it to you there. The religious background to Corinth goes well beyond Judaism and Christianity and Aphrodite. I mean, it used to be Aphrodite was the big player in town. Then Judaism comes in, and then Christianity comes in. And there's a little bit of Aphrodite going on. But look, there's a whole lot more that's going on there. Paul is probably in chapter 8 of 1 Corinthians talking about that kind of an issue. And again, I give you some notes about how the scholars are kind of speculating on that. I think it's just interesting background. Paul is writing, when he writes to the church at Corinth, he's writing to a church that is mainly Gentile. They're Greek Gentiles. And that's mainly what's happening at the church at Rome. Because these are people who are getting saved and their culture is right there in Corinth, they're bringing with them into their Christian lives a lot of pagan practices. So there's a lot of baggage that they're bringing in. The culture. Now, we're really going to talk about this next time in the first session more, because it's really important for you to get the flavor of this culture. It will make sense out of things that Paul is going to say early on about what they're valuing, what is important to them, and how they're thinking about things, and why Paul has to defend certain things that he says, because the cultural influence here in Corinth is almost unique unto itself. Yes, lots of places have paganism and idol worship. Okay. And so there's probably a number of places where the issue of meat that was offered to idols is going to come up. But it's a big deal in the Corinthian thing, and Paul has to address this in the letter. Not only that, but there's a cultural influence about what you need to be and what you need to know to really be someone of value. So this is a society in which you really have haves and have-nots, or people who are acceptable and people who are, the lower levels of society and unacceptable. That kind of, there's a lot of caste system that's going on at Corinth. So I just want to give you this out of the notes. So because they've got all this pagan and cultural influence, then you have the issue of meat. What do we do with this meat that's offered to idols? What do we do about promiscuity? Because in Corinth, it was a badge of honor to be promiscuous. And you were actually looked upon with favor. Any woman in the world who was known to be a prostitute was commonly referred to as a Corinthian girl. So that kind of tells you about what was going on in the society. If you engaged in debauchery, if people from that area went anywhere in the world and they saw people being lascivious in their behavior, they would say, oh, they're playing the Corinthian. So those terms kind of became synonymous with that kind of behavior. And because it was actually rewarded in the society, when a Christian comes along, he's under enormous pressure to keep living the way that he's used to living, or he's actually now going to be demoted in the minds of the other people that know him. He's going to be looked at now not in a way that is to be commended, but actually the very opposite of that. And so, and now there's one, I've got a little map here. I want to give you this one, and it's on your notes, and you can look at it there. It's a layout of the city of Corinth. Why didn't that show up in my PowerPoint? Anyway, I've got a layout of the city there. I know it's kind of small and compact, but one of the things we want to do next week is I want to lay this map out and enlarge it for you a little bit, because I want you to see where some of the terms are going to come from that Paul is going to use, especially when he talks about the bema seat, or the judgment seat of Christ. You've got an area, and again, I can't point to it up here, but if you're looking at that little map, you've got a central courtyard area called an agora, and in that area there's this. It's like town center, so to speak. And it's a big open public area. And there are shops all around the outside. A lot of business goes on. But there's a big high platform, and whoever is in power at that time would come out and sit on that platform, and you could bring, what am I doing?
Is the TV okay?
Yeah, I ran out of slides.
Okay.
So you could come before that platform and bring any legal matter that you wanted to get a judgment. And so this area, that was the judgment seat. And so Paul picks up on that idea when he's talking about the judgment seat of Christ. Now, I'm not saying he doesn't believe that there's a judgment seat and he's just kind of going off of Corinth, but actually what he's saying is the kinds of things that were going on there in the areas of justice and settling things, that's exactly what God is going to do at the judgment seat of Christ for the members of the body of Christ, to be able to solve all those things out. So anyway, I wanted to end this session with that one, and then like I said, we'll pick up on this next time and we'll kind of enlarge on that. Now, this is really all I wanted to do on this part of the foundation for this. The only thing left for us to do now is to really get an idea of the culture beyond that promiscuity thing that I talked about, to really be able to understand the intense peer pressure of behaving in a certain way, conducting yourself in a certain way. This is why in the book of Corinthians, and again, we'll scale this out next time in the detail of the verses. This is why what the book of Corinthians can be divided into 3 parts. Just like the pattern for edification in the book of Romans. Everybody knows what that pattern is, right? Godly thinking, godly living, and godly labor. In the book of Corinthians, here's what Paul is going to do. He is going to rebuke them for in the first third of the book, for their ungodly thinking. And he's going to expose all of this Corinthian culture. That's why it was the last thing I wanted to do before we got into the book, because you're not going to have any trouble at all seeing what was happening in Corinth and seeing that in our society today. And so when you see that, Paul is going to say, look, this is ungodly thinking. And if your thinking is ungodly, what do you think your conduct and behavior is? Well, okay. In the second part of the book, he's going to talk about their ungodly living. Okay? In the third part of the book, you've already figured it out. He's going to be talking about their ungodly labor. But I want to make a point about that. The ungodly labor is not about them inventing ways of laboring with God that they're really not supposed to. It's about them taking legitimate things they ought to be laboring with God in and corrupting it and perverting it so that it turns out to be ungodly at the end. And a lot of this is going to be due to the influence of the culture. So it's a lot of pressure. Now, last Sunday I talked about in Ephesus where Paul says, a great door of opportunity is open for me. I think he feels the same way about Corinth. But if it's going to be hard in Ephesus, it's going to be, I think, even harder in Corinth because they are already in church. Look, I know you have all that Ephesus philosophy going on and all that kind of stuff, but you have all of that in Corinth, plus all of the base things that are going on in the hearts and in the lives of people. And if you're going to be a believer in Corinth, you know what you'll be tempted to do? I'll be a secret believer. I'll be a believer in Jesus, but no one will know it. So I'll just kind of keep it to myself. Do you think Paul is okay with that? See, that and this is what is going to make it so easy. There's some slick talkers in the Corinthian assembly, and they're looking at Paul and they're seeing what he's doing. First of all, they're seeing all the things that are happening to him because of what he's preaching, and they're going, that doesn't look like fun to me. So they're saying, look, I'm paraphrasing it again. I think we'll see it when we get into it. Paul's a nice guy, and we like him, and he's really committed, but we are never going to grow this church if we tell people this is what their Christian life is going to be like. So we have to kind of let Paul go do his thing, but we need to modify the message a little bit. You know what that is? That's a phase one of the policy of evil. That's corrupt the message, attack the message. It's just this, you say, well, gosh, it seems like he just got this one thing, he does, attack the message, attack the messenger, describe. Yeah, you know why? Because it works. And so he's working it. So we're going to see this. So when we go through, you'll notice two things. This last thing I'll say, and then we'll be dismissed. First thing is, you're going to notice a lot of things that are in 1 Corinthians are actually like a commentary or maybe more detail about the very things that we saw back in Romans. It ought to be that way. Why? Because these are the people that were confronted with the Romans doctrine and veered away from it. So Paul is writing 1 Corinthians to get them back on track. So he's correcting their ungodly thinking. Then he's taking their ungodly conduct and behavior, their ungodly living, and correcting that. Then he's talking about, and if you're really going to do these operations of God and labor with him, you're going to have to fix this part as well. Now, when he's doing all of that, you understand this is corrective doctrine. And so the first thing you understand, this is coming right out of Romans. They should have learned this in Romans. Right. But they didn't. Partly because of the policy of evil, partly because of the culture, of where they were living, and all of that. The second thing you'll notice is there's a whole bunch that's going to be in here that is not true of you. Don't think there's nothing to be learned from 1 Corinthians just because that may not be true of you. Why? Because it may not be true of you, but it may be true of someone that you have the opportunity to minister to. And you'll need to understand what God says about all of that. Now, we give you an illustration of that, but I don't know of a proper way to do that. But I'm constantly amazed when I hear people defend things that I think everybody understands that's not right. But I get surprised by that. And so Corinthians is going to equip us to be able to do exactly what Paul is doing. And that's identify the errors, the doctrine to correct them. And do the good part of the thing is the Corinthians actually do get turned around. And then Paul writes to them 2 Corinthians, which is actually now equipping them for the next round of attacks from the policy of evil, because he knows that's going to be coming their way. All right, so there we are with that. We'll pick this up next time. Thank you for being here. This is the end of session 2. All right, thanks for coming, folks.